Sue stepped out of the subway station, feeling the winter wind cutting through the early evening air as she tightened her coat and hurried toward the co-working office, where she often spent her nights building the foundation of her new life. Yet, despite the rush of people around her, she could not shake the sense that someone was observing her from a hidden corner. She entered the tall glass building, glancing over her shoulder at the street behind her, but only the blur of headlights and pedestrians met her wary eyes, though the uneasy feeling lingered like a whisper brushing the back of her mind, urging her to stay alert as she pushed the elevator button and watched the doors slide open with slow hesitation. Inside the elevator, she stood alone with the hum of machinery echoing through the small space and her reflection staring back at her with a determination she barely recognized, because every day since the divorce she had forced herself to grow fiercer, stronger, and sharper, refusing to let Minja's betrayal define the rest of her life, even as memories of his cold confession kept creeping into her thoughts like shadows stretching across her path. When she finally reached her floor, she walked past rows of empty desks illuminated only by the pale glow of desk lamps left on by tired workers, and she made her way to her usual seat by the window where the sprawling Seoul skyline spread like a field of scattered lights, reminding her of how big the world was, and how tiny her heartbreak suddenly seemed, though she could not ignore the weight that sat in her chest waiting for something she could not yet name. As she opened her laptop and dived into her research, she felt the tension in her shoulders slowly unwind, but the silence around her seemed too thick, too still, too expectant, and every time the elevator chimed in the distance, she found herself pausing her breath as if anticipating the arrival of someone who should not be anywhere near her. New life hours later, with outlines and strategies filling her screen. She leaned back, stretching her aching neck, when a faint sound echoed from the far end of the office. A soft shuffle like rubber soles dragging lightly across the polished floor, and she froze, her hands hovering over the keyboard as the noise came again, almost deliberate, almost curious, almost like someone observing her from the shadows. She stood slowly scanning the dim aisle of desks but saw nothing except rows of empty chairs and silent monitors, though the uneasy thrum in her chest grew stronger, and she gathered her bag, deciding she had done enough for the night because the air felt too heavy, too watched, and her instincts whispered that staying any longer could unravel into something she was not prepared to face. As she rode the elevator down, she replayed the noise in her mind, convincing herself it must have been a cleaning staff member or a door shifting in the draft, yet the doubt would not settle, and when she stepped outside the building, she immediately noticed the same black car parked across the street, its engine off, its windows dark, and its presence too perfectly placed, as if waiting with intent. She pulled her scarf tighter and walked to the bus stop, pretending not to notice the car, even as she felt the unmistakable prickle of scrutiny prickling the back of her neck, and she quickened her pace, weaving between other pedestrians, seeking comfort in the crowd, though every step only made her more aware of the strange rhythm of footsteps echoing behind her at an almost matching pace. Reaching the crowded bus stop, she blended into the cluster of commuters, silently counting seconds as she listened for the footsteps again, but they faded into the noise of traffic, leaving her uncertain whether she had imagined them, or whether the person had simply melted back into the darkness, waiting for another moment to approach. When the bus arrived, she hurried on and took a seat near the window, watching the streetlights blur past as the city vibrated with its usual nighttime pulse. Yet her eyes kept drifting to the reflections behind her, half expecting to see a figure standing quietly near the back of the bus, observing her with unwavering focus, though nothing stood out except tired office workers scrolling through their phones. As she neared her stop, she gathered her courage, reminding herself that she was no longer the timid woman who once stayed silent in a marriage built on growing lies, and in that moment she promised herself she would protect the future she was building, even if ghosts of the past continued to walk beside her through the city streets. Stepping off the bus, she felt a strange calm settle over her as she walked toward her apartment building under the dim lamps, yet the silence of the residential block carried a strange weight, like the hush before a sudden storm, and she glanced around, noticing the shadows pooling in corners where the faint light could not reach. Inside the lobby, she nodded politely to the night guard, who barely looked up from his desk, and she entered the elevator feeling a faint chill crawl up her spine as the doors closed with an almost reluctant sigh, though she told herself it was simply exhaustion clouding her thoughts after a long, relentless day. When she reached her floor, she stepped out and headed down the quiet hallway, her footsteps echoing softly until she reached her door, where she paused, slightly confused because she thought she had locked the secondary latch that morning, yet now it seemed to sit at a slightly different angle, as though someone had touched it or tested it, but she pushed the thought away, chalking it up to a rushed morning. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and flipped on the lights. letting out a slow breath when everything appeared exactly as she left. Yet something in the atmosphere felt different, like a faint disturbance in the calm, a subtle shift in the air that hinted someone had been there moments before her arrival. Jisoo walked deeper into the apartment, checking each room one by one and finding nothing out of place, though the nagging sense of intrusion clung to her as she reached her bedroom and noticed her desk drawer slightly ajar, which made her pause, her heartbeat rising with every silent second. She approached the drawer and opened it fully, finding her documents untouched but the placement slightly different, like someone had skimmed through them carefully, leaving no mess but failing to replicate her exact arrangement, and she felt a shiver travel down her spine as she wondered who would care enough to look into her private plans before she could process the fear building in her chest. Her phone buzzed suddenly on the nightstand, causing her to jump as she reached for it, and saw an unknown number flashing across the screen, a number she had never seen before, making her pulse race. As she hesitated to answer, the phone continued to vibrate in her hand as she stood completely still in the silent room, sensing that whatever waited on the other end was tied to the footsteps, the car, the office sounds, and the faint changes inside her apartment, leaving her breath suspended in a moment she could no longer escape from. And Jay stood outside Jisoo's apartment, building his breath, fogging in the cool night air as he replayed the cryptic message he had received earlier that evening. A message sent from an unregistered number telling him that Jisoo was in danger and that he needed to go to her immediately, though the warning carried no explanation, no details, only an urgency that tightened around his chest like a vice he could not loosen. He had not seen her in months, yet the guilt that haunted him every day pushed him toward the building doors, each step loud in his mind as he wondered whether the message was real or just another cruel reminder of the life he had destroyed through one moment of weakness that had grown into a storm he could no longer control. He entered the empty lobby. The night guard glanced at him with a puzzled expression, but Min-jae hurried past without offering an explanation, his heart beating faster as he pressed the elevator button, feeling the same eerie stillness Jisoo had sensed only moments before, as if something unseen hovered between the walls, waiting for him to move. The elevator ride felt endless despite lasting only a few seconds, and when the doors opened, he stepped into the dim hallway, where the silence stretched unnaturally thick, each light casting long shadows that seemed to flicker at the edges, making him feel as though someone was trailing just out of sight, just beyond the faint glow. When he reached Jisoo's door, he noticed the latch sitting at an odd angle, though locked, and he felt the prickling certainty that he was not the only one who had been watching her life from the outside. Someone else was already far ahead of him, someone whose intentions were not softened by regret or remorse. Inside the apartment, Jisoo stared at the ringing phone, her hand frozen as she tried to steady her breathing before answering, yet the moment her finger touched the screen, the call abruptly disconnected, leaving behind a suffocating silence that pressed against her ears until she could hear her own heartbeat pounding like a drum. Trapped inside a narrow chamber, she slowly turned toward the doorway, sensing a presence lingering on the other side, and when she opened the door she nearly collided with Min-jae, whose face was pale, tight, and lined with a fear she had never seen even during the cold unraveling of their marriage, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Caught in the shock of the unexpected reunion, Min-jae stepped forward, raising his hands as if approaching a wounded animal, knowing Jisoo no longer trusted him and perhaps never would again, yet he whispered that he needed to warn her that someone was following her, someone with a reason far darker than anything he had ever imagined, though he struggled to explain how he knew or why the message had come to him and not to her. Jisoo stared at him, unable to decide whether to slam the door shut or pull him inside to demand answers, but before she could choose, a faint noise echoed from the end of the hallway, a soft metallic click, like a door closing or a tool being set down with careful intent, and both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the shadowed corridor where the light flickered like a pulse, struggling to stay alive. Min-jae felt a chill crawl up his spine as he stepped forward, placing himself instinctively between Jisoo and the hallway, though he knew he was in no position to protect anyone, not after everything he had ruined, yet the instinct to shield her surged stronger than his shame, and he strained to hear any movement beyond the slow hum of the ceiling lights. Jisoo took a cautious step beside him, her voice low, as she told him about the strange noises, the unexplained changes in her apartment, the car that followed her, and the feeling that someone had been closing in on her for weeks, threading their presence through her routine, like an invisible wire tightening around her little by little. And Min-jae felt the dread deepen because each detail mirrored the warnings he had received, hinting that someone had been manipulating both of them for reasons that still lurked beyond their understanding. Another sound followed, this time closer. A deliberate footstep pressing lightly on the polished floor. just beyond the corner, and Min-jae reached for Jisoo's hand, whether out of instinct or desperation he could not tell, while Jisoo felt the pressure of his trembling grip, a reminder that whatever waited ahead had already woven itself into both their lives with unsettling precision. Then the hallway lights dimmed for a brief second, plunging everything into a gray muted blur before brightening again as if someone had tampered with the circuit, and in that fleeting moment they thought they saw a figure retreating into the stairwell, moving with deliberate patience as though certain they would follow. Jisoo and Min-jae exchanged a tense glance, knowing that turning away would no longer keep them safe, and that confronting the hidden presence stalking their steps was the only path left, even if it meant walking straight into the shadow that had finally revealed its shape at the edge of the falling light, where danger waited in a silence that promised everything was only beginning.